Anton, nice to change the tables on you for a change, and I'll be in the interviewer seat this time. We have the FICA, we have regulations promulgated under the FICA, then we have guidelines, then we have what's called public compliance communications, etc. How does one make sense of it? How do you interpret it? What takes preference over what? If you are a new accountable institution and you have to understand how to read these things and how to make sense of them, with your legal experience and background, give us a short lecture on interpretation of statutes.
Chris, thank you. Yes, the FIC, the Act itself, is what I refer to as a primary piece of legislation addressing a specific topic. And the Financial Intelligence Center Act actually provides a nice introduction if you start with the definitions, because usually your primary piece of legislation provides you with a very nice set of definitions that clarifies the content of the legislation. Why I refer to as a primary set of legislation is that's the core of what FICA is all about. It provides a broad positioning of the reason, the objective of the legislation. It provides its intention. It provides for who are the stakeholders, who the legislation is aimed at, who is the regulator, what is the roles and responsibilities of the FIC Center, the center which we explained in a previous conversation. So the primary legislation is really setting the scene for providing to the reader what is the objective, who are the stakeholders, who would be regulated, why they would be regulated, and the primary legislation provides a solid foundation to say, how are we going to do this regulation? So the definitions play a very important part because it defines all the terminology that the reader must understand. So if, for example, Schedule 1 refers to accountable institutions. So now we go to Schedule 1 and it lists accountable institutions. If the Act didn't provide us with a definition of who an accountable institution is, it now opens the door for wide interpretation and uncertainty, etc. So the primary Act itself is your source. You need to start there because it codifies, it puts into law a specific accountability and who is going to manage that accountability. But then in the FIC Act itself, it provides for subordinate legislation.
Okay, can I interrupt you there? I just want to try and make sure that I'm with you. We've got the primary legislation, which is a statute, which is an act of Parliament, and the purpose of this is to create the context and to almost draw a border around saying, this is beyond this, we will not go. So it creates that boundary for us. So then my next question was going to be, it doesn't really in all instances tell us how to do it. It tells us what to do, but it doesn't tell us how to do it. What is the point of regulation then? Is that what regulation is there for?
Indeed, if I refer to subordinate legislation, it provides better pinpoint guidelines, almost a set of rules that say, we have given you the broad guideline and the framework for why this legislation is necessary. How do we refer to create clarity through the definitions? So every clause in the primary legislation would have some definitions that would apply to it, and then the regulations as part of the subordinate legislation. It's still part of the primary legislation, but it's almost like a guidelines as to how to practically deliver on or to comply with the legislation. It's more directive. It's better instructive in terms of the how.
Okay, so you make reference to primary legislation and subordinate legislation. What do you mean by subordinate in this context?
Subordinate legislation would be a set of rules and principles within the umbrella, under the umbrella of the primary legislation. It's almost, if I can use an example, in other legislation we have the primary legislation that refers to that there should be a code of conduct, that whoever is regulated how they must act, and that separate code of conduct will highlight exactly what needs to take place when they conduct the activity. So the primary legislation would create an umbrella. It's an overarching explanation of the legislation, but the subordinate legislation would address specific items or activities under that broad umbrella, and that is where the regulations fall into.
Okay, thank you. Germa, so help me again. So we've got primary legislation, and my understanding is that gets signed off. It's an act of parliament. It gets signed off by the president, and that has the highest authority. So it sets the boundary. Then we have subordinate legislation. In terms of regulations, those are regulations that are made and signed off by the relevant minister, so the Minister of Finance. So we can already see that there is a pecking order, that the subordinate legislation cannot supersede the primary legislation because of the level of seniority that it took to get the primary legislation in place. But there seems to be also other bits and pieces of subordinate legislation. Can you enlighten us on that, please?
So in terms of the primary act and the regulations, there is still an issue of interpretation. So additional documents are published to assist the public in interpreting these documents, these acts, these pieces of legislation. And I think that's where the public compliance communications comes in. They're open for comment, but at the end of the day, they are there to assist you to interpret the act as well as the regulations that is part of the act.
Okay. Is there a difference between public compliance communications and guidelines? It's a question that I struggle with. I'm not quite sure.
In my opinion, the guidelines are there to assist with interpretation. The public compliance communication could be guidelines, but it could also impose certain small amendments or interpretative measures in terms of the primary legislation.
Okay, but they do take on some coercive form.
If they are signed off, yes.
I think once they like the public compliance communication and the guidelines, some subsection of Section 4 of the Act says once the director of the Financial Intelligence Centre issues those, they have binding legal force. So the pecking order just keeps going down. Nirishi, you raised with me a particular practical issue that is of a little bit of concern. And that is that the public compliance communications and the guidelines are deemed to have been received and read by everyone once they're published on the FIC's website. What has your experience of that approach been?
Practically, nobody knows. So if you aren't checking it every day, you're not going to know that something was published. And I guess that's why the likes of compliance officers are useful, because it is in our day-to-day work, including in yours when you're working with the legislation all the time, to keep looking for these kind of announcements. But that said, it's difficult to find. So on the actual website, once it's published, the terminology, the naming convention, there isn't an index. So one needs to get familiarized with how to look for them. And then also when you read them, they're not always yes, they're meant to be more interpretive of what the legislation is trying to say. There are examples in them. In fact, they are highlighted, some practical examples where they will say Mr. X bought something from Mr. Y, and they'll actually give you a practical example. But one still needs to interpret that, and you will not necessarily find the exact situation that you're looking for at the time, but we'll need to look for something similar and hopefully, get your guidance from it. Failing all else, you need to log a query with the FIC on the website, and they generally do get back to you on all your queries.
Yeah, I think that your constructive criticism is very, very valid. A practical example is, for instance, the requirement that you must consult. How does the wording go? It says an accountable institution is strongly encouraged to consult all sources in determining whether your client is a politically influential person. What does that mean? It sometimes creates a bit more confusion than where it resolves it. So yes, there are particular challenges. Okay, but at least we've got the framework. We know that there's primary legislation which sets the scene and sets the boundaries beyond which we can't go and what the objectives are. Then we have subordinate legislation in the form of regulations, second in the pecking order because a minister has signed off on it, and then the guidelines and the public compliance communications, of which, the content of which all accountable institutions are deemed to be aware and which have binding power, and they sit last in the pecking order, but typically would be the go-to things for when you undergo an inspection to see whether you comply with those criteria, because they are the ones that deal with the operational issues in your business.
Chris, if I can just add, I think it's important to note that the subordinate legislation is not inferior to the primary legislation. The subordinate legislation are instructive measures. It gives absolute clarity, it tries to, and it provides us with definitive rules. So the fact that we refer to it as subordinate legislation doesn't mean it's inferior. Often, the subordinate legislation are actually the part of the legislation where people don't comply. And it's got the same effect. So the fact that the minister signs it off opposed to the president doesn't mean it's still part of legislation, and there's no pecking order in terms of importance.
Yes, very, very valid point, and easy to make that mistake. The minister, just when he makes regulations, can't make regulations that have a wider import than what the law permits. And that's what subordinate means. Okay. Well, thanks very much, guys. Very useful.